he said, so I was meant to be in one of the earlier sessions, but I've changed for timing reasons for somebody else. So hopefully of interest to you all nonetheless. I'm going to start with this quote. So the coach says you'll be released if you don't start booking your ideas up. So this is a statement from a 15-year-old footballer from Scotland who was representing an academy. And the reason that I think it's important is because it reminds us that sport can be, not sport is, but sport can be for some, in certain contexts, quite a cutthroat environment, a highly pressurized environment. And it's important to me because it suggests and underpins the idea that we need to examine perfectionistic climates in sport. Now, a perfectionistic climate or environment, if you like, is one in which athletes feel like the pressure that is put on them, the standards that they're meant to achieve in that environment aren't just high, but unrealistically high, that they feel like it's not just that they can't make mistakes, it's maybe that they can't make any mistakes at all, that even so small minor mistakes may be punished. They may lead to, for example, being released from an academy. And that's where my research comes in. So I want to talk about this idea of a perfectionistic climate. And importantly, I want to share with you all the development of a new questionnaire, a new psychometric scale that coaches, practitioners, researchers alike can use to better understand how perfectionistic certain sporting environments are through the eyes of their athletes, at least. So I've got a few QR codes that you can scan to get a hold of some of these resources. So please feel free to engage with that. A good place to start to think about this is to think about the idea that of the pressure to be perfect. Now, traditionally, this has been conceptualized as an individual issue. It's the person's sort of personality, and it dictates how they feel, how they think, and how they behave. And it's really great and important to study perfectionism and the pressure to be perfect at that level. But what it perhaps fails to appropriately consider is the idea that in certain specific environments, much like individuals themselves, the context that they encounter can also be more or less perfectionistic. So the classroom context for students can be more or less perfectionistic. The family home for certain individuals can be more or less perfectionistic. And also, importantly, in terms of this presentation, the sporting environment for athletes can be more or less perfectionistic. And this idea really isn't that new. We've given it a new name, we've talked about it, but really it's well grounded in established and studied models of perfectionism development, the idea that perfectionistic climates exist. And we know that, for example, key social agents, parents, the pressure that we feel to be perfect. And they can do so by shaping the environment through specific behaviors. And according to theory, these behaviors are, environments in which young people experience, key social agents, their parents, their teachers, their coaches as being extremely harsh, negligent, psychologically controlling, really difficult to please, like really, really difficult to please, and also extremely anxious about anybody in that environment making a mistake. So that's what we know, according to theory, perfectionistic climates to be. And all I've done, and with the help of the research group at York St John University, is formalize this idea. We've given it a definition. Here's perfectionistic climate. We've given it a hypothesized model. So this is the 5-factor model, if you like, that kind of talks about the different behaviors, the different practices, the different relational styles that underpin a highly perfectionistic environment. It includes, for example, unrealistic expectations, harsh criticism, control and conditional regard, which are forms of psychologically controlling behavior, and also extreme anxiousness regarding any mistakes. And what we've done is we've taken this model and we've introduced it to sport. If you listen to the keynote this morning, sport offers a good starting point because, in sport, the need to be perfect, the pressure to be perfect is often encouraged. It's revered amongst some athletes and coaches. And it's an environment where perfection is, as Andy said, sometimes required. And we've talked about the idea that we focus on the coach as an individual who some athletes may perceive, not all coaches, of course, but some athletes in certain contexts may perceive that their coach is a source of unrealistic expectations, a source of harsh criticism. They employ, perhaps in their minds, controlling practices, and they're really anxious about any mistake, no matter how small, being made. So this is the sort of starting point. And what we wanted to do was, with this, create a new questionnaire that coaches, practitioners, researchers can use to examine perceptions of the perfectionistic climate. And this is called the Perfectionistic Climate Questionnaire for Sport, or PCQS for short. And it involved a multi-stage procedure, which I've somewhat highlighted along the bottom here. So we started with writing the questionnaire statements or items. The coach expects all performances to be perfect. The coach punishes all mistakes, no matter how small. The coach is extremely anxious about all mistakes that could be made. And we got these reviewed by coaches, first of all. Do these coaches, not that we say you do them, but are they possible? Could they happen in sport? Yes, okay. We spoke to academics. Does this make sense based on your understanding of climate research and understanding of perfectionism, for example? And we also spoke, importantly, to youth athletes themselves. Can you read these items? Can you comprehend them? Do they ring true at all in terms of any of your experiences or any of the experiences that you've witnessed in a certain setting? And we got some good feedback regarding, as per the first statement, some ideas of more perfectionistic behaviors being relevant to the sports that the athletes were involved in. And then we took the items that we refined out to data collection, and we conducted a number of statistical recommended analyses to look at the structure of the questionnaire we created. And I'm going to show you some of them results now. So what we wanted to do really was create a set of 5 unidimensional subscales. What I mean by this is we want some of the items to capture expectations, only expectations. We wanted some of the items to only capture criticism, control, conditional regard, anxious, and so forth. And what this analysis, which is known as ESEM, or exploratory structural equation modeling, helps us to understand is if that was achieved or not. And the top and bottom of it is that we did achieve this 5-factor structure. And we can see here, for example, 4 of the items that we designed to measure coach expectations all provide a meaningful, significant loading on this first factor, and they provide small, non-significant, typically non-meaningful loadings across the rest of that row. And what that really means when it comes down to it is that these 4 items are good indicators of the same thing, that thing being coach expectations. They're not good indicators of the other behaviors, and that's what we want. We want a nice, clean structure, and that's what we found for expectations, criticism, all the way through to anxiousness, which I've highlighted there. So ultimately, we've got a clean factor structure. We've got a 20-item instrument that can be used to measure the 5 components of coach behavior that I previously identified. So it's good news in terms of the scale development project. This analysis here is very similar, and I've highlighted it in the same way for that reason. What this analysis adds, because it's slightly different, is this information on the very end here. What it tells us is, in addition to being able to use these items to measure expectations, criticism, control, conditional regard, and anxiousness, is that we can also almost bundle these all together. We can take each one of these scores to create an overall perfectionistic climate score. So we can look at it, the perfectionistic climate, both as individual components, but also as an overall construct, which is really important, this flexibility, when it comes to looking at different types of questions and analysis. So later on, I'll show you analysis where I'll look at an overall climate and how it leads to certain outcomes in sport. So just a bit of flexibility there for practitioners to use when it comes to using this questionnaire. If anybody wants to read the development of this scale, I've just provided a QR code here that gives you free access to the paper that's just recently been published. If you can't be bothered to read the whole thing and you don't care about it, but you want to see the questionnaire, please scan on the right-hand side. This will take you to the items, the instructions, the response format, which you can use to analyze the extent to which any environment is perceived to be perfectionistic. It may be your own. It may be that you want to go and do some research with some students or whatever. It would be great if you wanted to use this new questionnaire. So I'll leave them there for a second. What I want to talk about next is the duopoly. So there's a duopoly that exists in motivational climate research. Now, a duopoly is basically where two companies dominate a market. So Xbox and PlayStation dominate the game console market, arguably. And there exists one in motivational climate research. If you wanted to understand athletes' perceptions of a climate prior to this publication, you probably would have went to AGT, achievement goal theory, or SDT, self-determination theory-based models of the climate. And the reason I highlight these two is because they're the most popular, but also because they share some commonalities with the perfectionistic climate. So AGT includes ego-involving climates, where athletes perceive the coach places emphasis on outperforming others. You've got to beat others, that's all that matters. They view mistakes as worthy as punishment, and they value only, or they're perceived to value only, the better performers. So there's some commonalities there with perfectionistic climate. Similarly, from an SDT perspective, there's a controlling climate, which is where athletes perceive the coach as coercive, manipulative. They ultimately put pressure on athletes to get them to do what they want, to feel the way that they want them to feel. And there's once again some commonalities or some similarities there. And what we've argued is that a perfectionistic climate is similar, yes, but it's altogether more extreme. So it's more extreme than this. It's similar, yes, but it's different. They don't just want performers to outperform each other. They want them to be perfect. They don't just punish mistakes, they punish all mistakes, even the small ones. They don't just employ controlling strategies that limit autonomy and choice. They employ controlling strategies that get athletes to, with the aim of getting them to try and perform perfectly. It's very specific to this idea of perfection and unrealistic performance. So we argue there's differences. So the study that I did next was to try and prove this, to get some construct validity evidence for the PCQS. And I did that by measuring the PCQS alongside some SDT and AGT-based models that already existed and measures that already existed. And what I did, first of all, was an exploratory factor analysis. And what I was looking to see was whether the PCQS components, expectations through to anxiousness, could be regarded and be seen as being different from the existing measures and subscales of coach climate. And that's exactly what I found. So we found here three factors, three clear, distinct and discernible factors. The first one representing a perfectionistic dimension with the 5 PCQS subscales. The next one with ego and controlling subscales together, which represents, in line with previous research, a disempowering coach climate. And then finally, the third factor, which represents some of the more positive behaviors that coaches typically employ, for the most part, which are task involving, developing improvement over outperforming others, encouraging, mistakes to be made and looking at them as a learning process, and also perceived autonomy support. So the third factor here being an empowering dimension. So what's important really here is that the PCQS was different to existing measures. It offers something slightly new, something different, something altogether more extreme in terms of the type of experience that it's able to measure. And I also did a regularized network analysis. And ultimately, what we're looking at here is the exact same thing, just in a figure format. If you look down the left-hand side of this particular table, we've got 12 variables. I'll be quick, Tracy. 12 variables. We've got the same 12 variables here. It just shows the complex covariation between them. So we don't see that there, but we see it here. We see 3 factors here. And as I've seen here with an exploratory graph analysis, we see these 3 same factors, showing once again that we've got something different here. So it's just a slightly different way of showing the same results. And it's a bit more intuitive, I think, and a bit more exciting. So yeah, that's that. So it's different. Therefore, we've maybe broken this duopoly, which is being called for in previous literature. This idea of reconceptualizing the motivational climate is being called for. AGT and SDT aren't enough for us to understand athletes' perceptions of an environment. This QR code, if you're interested, is for a tutorial to the network analysis. What I'll leave you with is this final study. It's just 2 slides. Why should we care? What does a perfectionist climate actually mean? We're currently looking into it. And this initial study here shows that it may predict athlete burnout. So we looked at the overall climate predicting different symptoms of burnout. And we see that the 2 bottom symptoms here, physical and emotional exhaustion and sport evaluation, were significantly predicted by the climate. So it suggests that if you perceive this extreme pressure, it may deplete the resources that come from training and competing in a perfectionistic environment. I haven't got what it takes to give anymore, physically and emotionally. I'm done. And it can also lead to the development of a more cynical attitude towards sport. My time could be spent doing something better now. What's the point? So some evidence there of some not very nice consequences. And this kind of underpins this need for us to create some resources to get the word out. So there's another free resource here if you're interested. A very simple one, albeit, but showing behaviors that should perhaps be avoided to avoid a highly perfectionistic climate, whereas behaviors that, parallel behaviors that should be encouraged. So we're not saying don't set high standards. We're saying maybe make sure that they're high, but realistic and reasonable based on a performer's ability, who you're playing against, whether they're injured. Whereas a perfectionistic climate's rigid and inflexible. So that's the key difference that I've highlighted in these tables here. So if you're interested in that, give it a scan. Other than that, though, thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry if I've gone a little bit over there, Tracy. But yeah, happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Your timing was actually perfect. Pardon the pun. Does anyone have any questions for Michael? Mark.
Yeah, sorry, could I just ask a question? I think it's I'm fascinated by a lot of these talks. I work in a football academy as a coach myself. So some of this stuff is really, really interesting, and it was very insightful, that Michael. One thing I'd be interested to know is around expectations and I guess the link or relationship between player expectations and their perceptions versus a coach, and anything around the reconciliation of that or the mediation of that, because I think this seems to be embedded in perception and expectation of players, and I guess a potential mismatch with coaches. So just any sort of insights around that would be great.
No, it's a really interesting question, and it's one that I think it's so complicated that there's a lot of elements to it. And I think that, on the one hand, a player could have, unrealistic expectations of themselves because of their own personality. And that can, as Andy talked about earlier, as Luke talked about, that can lead to, lots of different things. Sometimes positive, it could maybe lead to an increase in, persistence and effort that could underpin better performance, but it could also lead to anxiousness, worry about all that. So that's the player themselves. If we just look at that in isolation, that's that. If you look at the coach's expectations or perceived expectations, that's equally could lead to some debilitating sorts of outcomes. Like Luke identified earlier, could lead to athlete burnout. I'm suggesting here, once again, it could lead to athlete burnout. What would be interesting, I think, and I don't know if you're getting at this or not, is to see whether if them things match up. If you've got high expectations or unrealistic high expectations of an athlete, and so is your coach, there could be some sort of harmony there. Maybe that works when that matches, as opposed to when it doesn't. And I think that's a really interesting idea, that when an athlete and their coach are maybe compatible in the expectations they have for themselves and one another, perhaps that could be harmonious in some sort of way, even though the standards are unrealistic. Who knows? I think maybe when there's a mismatch, that's especially when there could be more problems. So if an athlete hasn't got that high expectations or not that unrealistic, but the coach has for them, perhaps that's when there could be trouble at home, as it were.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, because I think one sort of strategy to try and mitigate that type of thing is sort of a joint agreement in terms of targets and where a player can try and improve upon, and that's sort of agreed between the player and the coach sometimes. I appreciate there's obviously power relations in that, because maybe it's coach led and the player just wants to sign up to what the coach believes. But I think there's an element of, if we can get sort of player empowerment right and have these environments where players feel that they can contribute and they feel safe or psychologically safe, then perhaps there can be some mitigation in terms of that type of thing. But yeah, it's just interesting in terms of the balancing of expectations between player and coach, because like you say, it can lead to a lot of issues.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Definitely, like it's important for it to be realistic for that individual, and I guess you need to speak to them and work that out collaboratively in lots of ways to know what's too high, what's unrealistic versus just high enough, if you know what I mean, because you don't want to not push them, but you need to know where that line